Good afternoon, everybody. I'm RT Rybak from the Minneapolis Foundation, where we cultivate change together. I want to welcome you to our education policy briefing. It shouldn't be a surprise to anybody that the Minneapolis Foundation is doing something on education. Out of all the partners we have and all the issues we work on, there's no issue that is of more concern to everybody we work with than education. But you may get stuck on that word policy for a second. Isn't the Minneapolis Foundation known for grant making, for getting money out into the community? Well, money matters, and we're proud of what we've been able to do with it. A few years ago at our 100th anniversary, we were really proud of the fact that $40 million a year flowed through the foundation and its partners out into the community. It went across all spectrums and especially to education. We're even prouder of the fact that that 40 million a few years ago has now turned into more than $100 million a year out. Money matters, but money doesn't make the kind of change we need, and that is especially true in education. If it did, our education systems and our students would be doing much better today. It's going to take more than money, and policy is one of the impact levers that we're going to use, and you're going to hear today some of the strategies that are taking place right now as the state of Minnesota considers what is perhaps the largest significant investment in education in history, and policies that could say a lot about how our children are educated over the coming years. When I said impact levers, we're saying that impact levers include not just money, it includes advocacy, it includes coalition building, which we've very much done in education by bringing together first young people of color, then educators, policymakers, and community. It includes partnerships like the partnership we have that has connected Minneapolis Public Schools to some of the top implementation scientists at the University of Minnesota. It involves research like the principal study we've just concluded, and it involves advocacy. And to understand how advocacy fits into our larger strategic framework and the rest of our work, I want to introduce our Chief Impact Officer, Chanda Smith-Baker.
Good afternoon. I'm looking for my face on the screen, but good afternoon. This is Chanda Smith-Baker. I'm the Chief Impact Officer at the Minneapolis Foundation, and welcome to our education briefing this afternoon. As our team mentioned, the Minneapolis Foundation is using our philanthropy and the levers that we've defined in our strategic framework to go upstream, as we know that money alone will not solve the issue. That we need to go upstream and make sure that the policies that we are advocating for are exclusive, that drive the policies that will take care of our most vulnerable students and push an agenda that it creates an equitable education for all of our students. One piece of our framework that's incredibly important is us getting proximate, and you will hear in this partnership how the policy decisions that we have been making, our grant making strategies that we have been centered by the students, the practitioners, the teachers, educators that are most proximate to the issues, that are helping us define where we go, understand where we think those policy levers will make the biggest difference. So without further ado, I will pass this over to Patrice and we will get this policy briefing underway. Thank you again for joining.
Thank you so much, Chanda, and thank you so much, RT. I'm really excited to be here today with the panel. Before we launch into the policy agenda, I want to introduce the wonderful person to my right, Kenneth Avon. He's the founding executive director of the Advancing Equity Coalition. One of the things that's always stood out to me about Kenneth is that he just has a very deep personal and professional belief in public education, and that it's something that should matter to everyone in our community, regardless of whether or not they have kids in the schools. I've known him for over 7 years, and one of the things that's really stood out about Kenneth is that he diligently attends school board meetings and consumes news and information about public policy related to education at the district, state, and local level. The things that you hear about in the media today, Kenneth knew about a week ago because he went to those meetings. So for years, I've just been impressed by his command in terms of policy, but also his skills in terms of bringing different types of people from various communities together to advocate for education equity. And that's the founding, that's what's rooted behind the founding of the Advancing Equity Coalition. One of the things I like to do is go and find quotes from people and then read them, even when they didn't know I was going to do that. So I want to read one from Kenneth that really stands out to me. There are so many issues today, like public safety, housing, and climate change. And we're going to need all of our young people to be educated and prepared so they can help us to solve these issues. He deeply believes that. That's deeply behind the founding of the Advancing Equity Coalition. And without much further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kenneth, and he'll get us started and introduce our wonderful panelists. So thanks, Kenneth.
Thank you, Patrice. I don't even remember where that quote's from, but I do believe it. So thank you.
I got it from the Graves Foundation website.
Well, yes, thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. As Patrice mentioned, my name is Kenneth Avon, and I'm the co-founder and the executive director of the Advancing Equity Coalition. Our vision is every child in Minneapolis Public Schools receives a high quality education. In order to achieve that, we have decided to focus on our mission is to develop the political will to eliminate institutional racism in Minneapolis Public Schools. This is a very, very important mission to us. This was a very, very intentionally selected mission because we think that systems change is where we need to be. And we think Minneapolis Public Schools is where we need to focus. You know, I've spent several years in advocacy, education advocacy. And, you know, there's a lot of places to be paying attention at the Capitol, at the federal level, at the school level, and at the district level. And through all my time, we're all kind of just chasing, what was the moment, right? As opposed to having a dedicated focus to a specific place. And so the Advancing Equity Coalition is really dedicated to making sure Minneapolis Public Schools is working for all students, especially our students of color and our Indigenous students. If you can go to the next slide. We said that we see institutional racism in 5 main ways in Minneapolis Public Schools: through resource and opportunity hoarding in white and wealthy communities. And so when we're talking about resources, yes, we're talking about money, but we're talking about where are our most experienced teachers going? Where are all of our AP, IB honors classes? Where are they offering languages? Where is their additional ability to fundraise, right? So that's when we're talking about resource and opportunity hoarding. Yes, it's the money that's going to white and wealthy communities, but it's also where are all of the other resources that are very important to student academic success also going. We also are looking at irrelevant curriculum and instruction. So we know that there's a lot of challenges with students who are going to school and not being able to relate to the curriculum, not being able to relate to the type of instruction that's being given and who is giving the instruction. And so really focusing on trying to make sure that all of that is relevant so that students have interest and are engaged and want to be in their classrooms. We also are looking at race neutral policies and practices, a lack of accountability structures, and then devaluing BIPOC communities and their cultures, right? These are really important aspects as well, because we know that the society and the institutions that were built were not built for us, were not built for people that look like this panel today. And so making sure that those policies are built for that and that there is accountability to making sure that our systems operate in that way is really important. And so finally, I want to introduce our coalition members. We are really focused on creating a diverse, multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial coalition with perspectives from the community, from the classroom, and from everywhere in between. And so we are excited to be partnering with several important and powerful organizations that are focused on not only just education justice in our community, but overall justice in our community. And we just bring them together to focus on education and specifically in Minneapolis Public Schools. And so we have 2 of our organizational partners here today on our panel to help talk about our policy agenda and the areas of expertise that they bring. So first, I want to introduce Nafisa Mohammed. Nafisa is the new director of organizing for Educators for Excellence Minnesota. Prior to her role at Educators for Excellence, Nafisa was a high school English teacher in MPS for 8 years, spending the entirety of her time in MPS at North High and Patrick Henry High School. In addition to teaching, Nafisa took on a number of leadership roles that include equity lead, instructional lead, English department chair, and was also very active within the Minneapolis Teachers Union, which led to her running for vice president of the union in 2020. Thank you so much, Nafisa, for joining us. Next, I'd like to introduce Malaika Avon. Outside of being my wonderful wife, Malaika is the interim executive director of the Legal Rights Center here in Hennepin County. In her time at the Legal Rights Center, Malaika has worked closely with MPS to support in implementing restorative practices across the district and led advocacy campaigns regarding juvenile justice reform. Malaika received her undergraduate degrees in education and biology at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and also holds 2 master's degrees, one in social work and one in public policy from the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. She's currently a community faculty member at the University of Minnesota School of Social Work, teaching in the graduate class or in the graduate school on macro social work and community organizing to really hone in on systems change from the social work perspective. I am proud to be in partnership with these organizations and these amazing women who are both policy changers and have practical experience in the work they're leading. And I believe you'll learn a lot from both of them today. So Nafisa and Malaika, thank you for joining us today.
And before Kenneth launches into the policy agenda overview, I just wanted to let everyone know that we will be doing a Q&A shortly after 1 p.m. So feel free to put those questions in the chat and we'll get to them later.
Awesome. So let's get into the policy agenda. So we are calling our policy agenda the Plan for Student Success in MPS. As I said before, our organization is very focused on Minneapolis public schools. And so these policy recommendations, these issues that we're following we have a unique focus on making sure how do these policies improve MPS. We also know that all these policies are going to be good for the full state. But with our specific focus and with our base that we're building across the city, we wanted to make sure we identified how this was going to be positive for MPS in particular. So don't get chased off by the name if you're not as focused on MPS, because this is going to actually support the entire state. So our first area of focus and the first area of our plan is around investing in a diverse teaching force. We want to make sure that we have teacher diversity, and we know that the state has to put forth money and change statutes to ensure that student teachers of color and Indigenous teachers, prospective Indigenous teachers, can enter the classroom. The next is to disrupt the school to prison pipeline. We know that students are losing the opportunity to be kids, to be in the classroom because of the way we approach school discipline. And so we have an important duty to make sure we make that students stay in the classroom and do not lose any learning opportunities. And also have ways to make sure that they can process emotions, process energy, and don't end up in our criminal justice system because of the ways that we've stigmatized them in the classroom. And then finally, we have to talk about school finances and how we fund education. So we owe a debt to our students because of the way that we have financed public education for the last 20 years. And it is time for the state, with their $17 billion surplus, to put that money into students and put that money into education. And so we're excited about bills moving through the legislature now, and we're excited to talk to you about some of the ones that we're following. So with that, I'm going to kick it to Nafisa so that she can tell you all about investing in a diverse teaching force. Nafisa, take it away.
Thank you, Kenneth. Again, my name is Nafisa Muhammad. I am currently the Deputy Director of Campaigns and Organizing with E4E. But prior to that, I was a teacher and a member of E4E. Like Kenneth said, I taught for about 8 years in Minneapolis Public Schools, all in North Minneapolis at North High School and at Patrick Henry High School. And it's funny, as you're talking about the policy priorities with regard to increasing teachers of color and diversity, disrupting the from school to prison pipeline, and increasing resources. Teachers of color do that, instinctually, because of our cultural assets, because of our background, because of our language, we do that. And so I'm very excited to be able to talk about increasing teacher diversity, because one, I am a Black teacher, and two, when I first became a teacher, I thought like being in the classroom was my dream. I'm just gonna teach Black kids how to articulate themselves and feel empowered. But what I realized is that there are so many layers, political layers, that keep teachers like me out of the classroom, that push us out the classroom, and therefore we're not able to realize that dream that we had to become teachers in the first place. So we talk about recruiting teachers of color, and we talk about retaining them, and policy protects them. Resources support them. And so as I was teaching, I became a union steward. I didn't run for first vice president of our union. I was going to run for president of our teachers union while on strike. And in that experience, I also seen how funding becomes a wedge between educators and the community. And so I'm on a break right now as a teacher, and putting forth all of my energy towards helping E4E bring in authentic teacher voices to be truly with community and in community, so that we have more of a grassroots approach, which is what, you know, I do for free. So in my time, my 3 months here at E4E in this role, we have had teacher action teams that are brought 3 groups of teachers together where they came up with policy recommendations. And one of those policy recommendations was around diverse, you know, and expanding the diversity within teaching in Minnesota. And so a lot of their policy recommendations, thankfully, you will find in House File HF 320, where they're asking for over $100 million of investments in recruiting and teaching, recruiting and retaining teachers of color. So we see where they're investing more into grow your own programs. They're investing in the mentorship, which I really am an advocate for as well. So if we're going to bring them in, we got to support them, and we got to pay the teachers to do it. And so that's one investment. Curriculum is an investment. Climate and culture is an investment. And so is the tier licensure system, as well as how we're licensed. It's a stratification, I would like to call it, where tier 1 and tier 2 teachers are considered these second-class educators, where I guarantee you most of their students do not see them as second-class educators. A lot of them are experienced educators who have come from other countries, other states, and our test that license us has been a barrier for a lot of teachers of color. And then just traditional pathways have also been a barrier. I'm a product of a traditional pathway, and I'm also a teacher who advocates for modifications and accommodations with regard to learning. And so solely relying on one way to increase teachers of color eliminates bridges and pathways to bring, you know, non-traditional teachers in, teachers from other countries and other states. So there is currently a bill, House File 1224, that is trying to dismantle the tier licensure system. So while we have the Increased Teacher Color Act trying to expand the pathway, increase supports and protections, we have House File 1224 that is saying that we don't need those pathways. We'll grandfather everyone into a tier 3 license. But our question is, especially those who are on a tier 1 and tier 2, why are you trying to eliminate the pathway? Before I took on this role, I was also slated to be a pathway coordinator, education pathway coordinator at Patrick Henry High School, where it's all students of color who want to become educators. They need to see that there are alternative pathways. They need to see that they can go around the system if they have to, especially if they've been victims of it and they seek to change it. So I want to be able to talk to those kids and say, these are all the pathways to becoming an educator, not just one. And so as one of the roles that E4E is playing around this at Bill is that we are organizing our members, which we have over 2,000 of them in the state, to testify in opposition of House File 1224, name how important it is that we expand the pathway instead of shrinking it. So we're collecting testifiers to show up at the state to testify, but we also are delivering handwritten or personalized notes to educators, community members, state representatives, their senators, so that they can say, this is why this is important to me. This is why it matters to me. And so our organizers are going into the school communities, asking them to say, tell your representative that you are their constituent. They need to listen to you, and they need to expand the pathway for teacher diversity. And we hand delivered over 100 of those personalized notes during our lobby day on February 2nd, and we're saying every day is lobby day. So anytime we can get a note from someone to talk to their representative, we're going to get it and we're going to deliver it to them so that they hear from everyone and not just specific privileged groups. Thank you.
Nafisa, do you want to talk a little bit about, where is the opposition coming from on both of these bills?
Absolutely. Mainly the opposition is around Pellsby and Education Minnesota, who are saying that these pathways are unnecessary, that they deprofessionalize the fields, and also teacher prep programs who also benefit financially to drive all educators towards their that specific pathway. And so most of the opposition is coming from those who have a vested interest, right? So critical race theory would say that there is always some entrance convergence, right? And if you look at the entrance convergence of those who are opposing expanding the pathway or promoting limiting it, they are the ones who have some more to gain than to lose. But we're saying eliminating one teacher of color out the pathway or out of the field is a travesty to all kids, especially kids of color. So mainly that's what it is. They're trying to create this narrative as if one way gets to becoming an effective teacher of color. But I know it's really OJT, right? You learn as you go, you do professional development, you find your mentors and your coaches. But they're just trying to limit the pathway. So I would say the Pellsby, which is our licensing board, and Education Minnesota, which is our state union.
Yeah.
And for the audience, Pellsby is the Professional Educator Licensing and Standards Board.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I think, something else that is, I would personally say is of concern, especially for the bill that is being pushed forward around increasing teachers of color across the state, is the $100 million investment. Because it's not just a 1-year $100 million investment. They're asking for an ongoing
Absolutely.
$100 million investment, which I believe in. I strongly believe in. But we know that, the state is going to have a lot of competing priorities when it comes to its budget, and, trying to figure out where those resources are put and how many of those resources are put in place, I think is going to be important. And so, for example, I think the governor's budget did not put as much money into the governor's proposed budget, I should say, did not put as much money that is being proposed by the state legislature, right? And so I think, outside of the, opponents of especially the tiered licensure, we're looking also at trying to figure out how do we make sure that the state puts in the max amount of money, all the money that's being requested, investing into increasing teachers of color. Because we know how important it is. We know that in Minneapolis public schools, only 1 out of 5 educators or licensed teachers, I should say, are teachers of color. We have plenty of ESPs, educational support professionals, who are educators of color. About 50% of our educational support professionals are educators of color, but only 20% of our licensed educators are educators of color, when we have 66% of our students who are students of color. And across the state, we only have 4% of our educators, our licensed educators, that are educators of color. So it's a big issue. And we know how important teachers of color really are for our students. We know that they improve academic outcomes. We know that they improve engagement, graduation, entrance into rigorous course taking. So this is an important thing.
And
so
I think, I think the ironies or the paradox of like policy and professional development is that we never do the things that we say is best practice for kids, like wraparound services. So the reason for the 100 million, I look at it as wraparound services. I am a teacher of color. I know how hard it is to stay in the profession. I also know how isolating it is. I also know the lack of support we get. I also know the lack of mentorship we get. So just getting us into a classroom is not enough. we need wraparound services. So it is an awesome point. It's like, well, why all this money? And I think about all the other bills with climate change and policing, investing in your teachers of color so that they can help raise the generations who are more equity minded, who are more inclusive, so that you don't have to keep going to the state and because we will raise children who have an anti-oppression view because they will be taught by teachers who stuck it out because they felt the support. They felt like they belonged. Absolutely.
Do you want to talk a little bit about some of the parts of, especially the Increasing Teachers of Color Act, that does invest in like the change in school climate to help retain educators in the building?
Absolutely. I think that the climate in the building for a lot of teachers of color is kind of like, it's under the rug, it's swept under the rug, and it's encompassed as it's a whole large problem for educators versus it being situated to the context of teachers of color. So increasing professional development around equity, mentorship, affinity groups, right? Investing in that, providing grants so that teachers of color can invest in themselves. Name the thing. Right now, I belong to a BIPOC affinity group that we created while we were on strike. We applied for a grant. We got $30,000 to come together as an affinity group, get the professional development that we feel like we need to support us. So also empowers us as well. And so, yeah, I hope did that answer?
Well, I was also going to point to some of the curriculum changes that are being made in the bill to make sure that it has a more diverse range of perspectives in our curriculum, because, and you can speak more to, what a diverse curriculum actually also does in terms of retaining teachers of color.
Absolutely. We're not put in a position to be conflicted with the truth and reality of what we're teaching versus some kind of prescribed curriculum that doesn't even honor our own humanity. So the curriculum change is rooted in ethnic studies, because the problem is that when you give people a choice, they choose what they're most comfortable with. And so we are tasked, a lot of teachers of color are tasked with the additional job of writing curriculum, creating curriculum that fits our students, fighting against our colleagues who don't honor the kind of curriculum. So it does create a standard of what education actually is supposed to look like. What are we doing as educators with regard to our pedagogy? And so I just think it creates a standard of inclusion with regard to curriculum, which also helps with climate. It helps with belonging. It helps with inclusion. So all the DEI money that we pour into our districts around doing that job to educate and making it a choice, when it's policy, it's not a choice.
Yeah, I 100% agree. And that's why we're excited to be partnering together to push both of these issues forward as priorities at the Capitol. So we'll hear more from you, Nafisa. Thank you so much for giving us an introduction and a little bit of an overview around some of the issues that we're focusing on within investing in teachers of color and diversifying our teaching workforce. Was going to pass it now to Malaika to talk a little bit about the disrupting the school to prison pipeline, and if you want to do an introduction about the Legal Rights Center and the amazing work that you all do.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kenneth. I think we always get this question at the Legal Rights Center when we're in these spaces, like, why are y'all talking about education? But it's so rooted in the history of our organization. So the Legal Rights Center is a nonprofit law firm. We're a public defense corporation as designated by the state. And we were founded in 1970 by Black activists in North Minneapolis and the American Indian movement. Folks who were looking for high quality public defense for our communities. This was at the tail end of the civil rights movement, and folks were looking for attorneys who could represent both the activists on the street and low-income community members who were experiencing the injustices of our criminal legal system. So a majority of our work from our history has been representing youth and adults in Hennepin County Criminal Court. But since our founding, community members have been coming to us and saying, like, we need a robust system of community support for young people so that they don't end up in your offices needing criminal defense representation. And so we developed a partnership with Minneapolis Public Schools in the early 2000s to help support them in really thinking through how they can interrupt the school to prison pipeline as it's existing in their schools. So we partner with MPS. We've worked with awesome educators like Nafisa over at Henry and North, but across the district to facilitate neutral restorative practices in schools. We facilitate circles and conferences and mediations between students and staff, between families and schools, between staff members themselves. We really see ourselves as providing a space for people to come together to repair harm in a neutral way. Sometimes you just like need someone outside of the family to come in and like clean up the mess a little bit. And we try to make space for that. At the Legal Rights Center, we're a part of a couple of coalitions who are working on policy advocacy at the legislature that are focused on disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And so the first couple of bills that I'm going to talk about today are in partnership with this amazing coalition that we're a part of, besides the Advancing Equity Coalition, which is called Solutions, Not Suspensions. And so this coalition is inclusive of students and staff members, educators and parents and community members who really believe that we can build an education system in Minnesota that doesn't require exclusionary discipline practices. So for years, we've been at the Capitol advocating for changes in the ways that our laws require schools to interact with young people when there's been harm that's happened.
Really quick, do you mind just defining what exclusionary discipline practices is?
Absolutely. So when we talk about exclusionary discipline practices, we're thinking about the decisions that are made in classrooms and by school administrators to take children out of learning environments as a way of punishing or teaching them appropriate behavior. Our belief is that there are ways that young people can always be successful in learning spaces, and that we can continue to support them, to wrap our arms around them, that doesn't require their removal from opportunities for learning. And so one of the bills that we're really excited about this year creates a ban on suspensions for students in kindergarten through third grade. A couple of years ago, our coalition was successful in passing a ban on pre-K suspensions, which is, I think, something that's like kind of hard for people to wrap their minds around. Like, what would it be like to have your preschooler sent home from school, suspended from school? What sort of message that sends to young people, but also their families about their value and worth and whether or not they're deserving of an education? And we believe that the same sort of perspective should be carried on to kindergarten to third grade teachers or students.
Do you give people an idea of like how big of an issue it is in terms of like the prevalence of K through 3 suspensions?
Absolutely. We see, especially within students of color, like major disparities in the use of exclusionary discipline practices, but especially suspensions, and really high numbers of students in grades kindergarten through third grade who are getting suspended. Now, often when we're talking about students that young, we're seeing often suspensions for what can be at times considered more, I'm trying to think of the word. Subjective, yes. I was going to say at will, but I'm like in my legal headspace, but subjective issues. So these are not like explicit policy violations where it's deemed by the district, if you do this behavior, then it's an automatic suspension, but often as a result of, long-standing issues between students and educators or between families and educators, we're seeing decisions being made to remove students from the classroom. Did that answer that question? Yeah. Okay, great. So what this bill does is say that, for our youngest learners, for whom being in the classroom, it's such critical learning opportunities, we are asking districts and asking schools and asking educators to really look to non-exclusionary ways to teach discipline and to teach the behaviors that we want to see in the classroom rather than sending them home. The bill includes funding for schools, grants to districts so that they can train their staff, develop alternative opportunities for learning, things that like many of our educators are already doing, right? Like more space and time and even staffing for extensive partnership with families, developing different spaces within classrooms or within buildings for young people to continue learning, even if being in the classroom isn't the space for them to be at that particular moment in time. And so we really see this as an opportunity for our state to invest differently and how we're working with young people and families. Sometimes the pushback that we hear on this bill is that you're taking a tool away from educators. Suspension is a tool that we have to keep our learning going, to keep our classrooms safe. And we think of it as a tool that's like just a bad tool. And instead, we want to be investing in good tools that work for young people and work for their families. And at the end of the day, communicate to them that they are deserving of learning opportunities. And that even in their hardest moments, even in the most challenging times, this school community is willing to sit with you and invest in your learning so that you can have success. Another policy that we're really excited about that has come from community members and families is a ban on withholding recess as punishment. So many folks might have experienced this themselves. I would say I was a pretty well-behaved child. I was like the first daughter, so I was like always very put together. But there were a few times where I remember my class getting recess detentions, right? Where you can't go out to play because your class has been bad, or you aren't allowed to go out to recess because you're being punished. It's just not a good tool for young people and for students. We know that recess is a critical time for social and emotional learning and peer interactions, for young people to have the opportunity to move their bodies. And so to punish a young person by taking away recess, research has shown that it creates more distrust between the young person and that critical staff member, that teacher or educator in their lives. And they're missing those really critical opportunities for engaging in their school community. Similar to the K-3 suspension ban, the bill outlines ways that we're excited for schools to think differently about how they're supporting young people who might need additional time to work on work that they didn't finish in class, or who might need to learn a different way of relating to their peers without punishing them by taking away this critical time of their day, that time of recess. And then the final piece that we're really excited that we're working on is in partnership with a different coalition, not solutions, not suspensions, but the Minnesota Coalition for Youth Justice, is around making sure that young people are really protected, especially their legal rights are protected in school settings. So this is a bill that has been championed in the last couple of years by legislators, and we're continuing to work on the language, and we're hoping that it'll get introduced pretty soon here. This bill makes sure that any statements that students make to school staff in what we're calling a non-custodial interrogation, so a conversation that's being had between an administrator and a young person, that those conversations are safe and protected and can't be used as evidence against a child in the courtroom setting. The best example of what this often looks like in practice is that there will be an incident at a school. Let's say two kids get into a fight and they go to the principal's office, and the principal will have them write down their side of the story and sign their name, or they'll tell their teacher their particular vantage point on what has happened. And then a prosecutor will make a decision to charge a young person for that incident. And then the school staff member will be compelled to turn over those written or to show up in court and testify about the oral testimony that they've heard from a young person. And so where this child thought that they were going through a traditional school-based discipline practice, they were just, answering the questions of a principal, has now been seen by the courts as a signed confession, where they never had the opportunity to talk to a lawyer. They had no idea what their typical Miranda rights are, their right to an attorney. And it's used against them in ways that can end up with them having deep involvement in the juvenile justice system and a criminal record that could follow them for the rest of their lives. So what this bill would do is to say that any evidence that is gathered in these sort of interrogations of children without an attorney present would be inadmissible in court, and then provides an opportunity or pathway for young people and encouragement, really, for schools to make sure that if they're doing these sort of interrogations or investigations, especially under certain circumstances, that they're making sure that young people have access and understand the need to talk with an attorney. We know that during typical adolescent development, But childhood development broadly, there are many opportunities and times where young people make mistakes or make really poor choices. We know that our schools have been sources and sites of really horribly tragic incidents. And we believe that there is a different approach rather than a punitive approach to the reality of bringing a whole bunch of tiny humans together and asking them to grow and learn. So our work is really about thinking through how we're protecting the sanctity of childhood for kids kindergarten through 12th grade. You know, they're 18 years old, they're still babies in many cases. We want to make sure that we're creating safe spaces within our schools for them to learn, for them to grow, to be the young people who are solving our climate crisis or our public safety issues. And that schools can be spaces where they can do that without fear that what happens when they make poor choices or when they make mistakes is going to lead up to them being involved in the justice system. And I think with all of the policies that we're working on, you know, we believe that safety comes with accountability and with the support. And so as we're thinking about investing in non-exclusionary discipline or investing in alternative ways for young people to have social emotional learning, they can still be accountable for the choices that they're making or the mistakes that they make. We know that's an important part of learning and growing, but accountability doesn't have to look like punishment in the ways that it does every day for students in Minnesota right now.
Yeah, and it certainly doesn't need to result in lost opportunities for learning, right? And lost opportunities for instruction, and then turn into really grave situations like being involved in the juvenile justice system. So
Absolutely.
thank you so much, Malika. I had a question just in terms of, again, the opposition. You know, where are we seeing opposition in all of these issue areas, or where have we historically seen opposition?
Absolutely. You know, people are multifaceted and we have supporters on both sides. None of these issues I would say are particularly partisan, but we do see opposition, especially around some of the bans on exclusionary discipline from the Principals Association. And we've heard from some associations of other administrative groups as well. Again, this idea that we're taking away tools that they need. And our response in the ways that we've tried to, you know, work to find compromise and ultimately a bill that will work for young people in schools is to offer these alternative incentives and funding mechanisms so that it isn't taking away a tool, but rather introducing another way of being in relationship with young people.
Can I add to that?
Yeah,
Jill?
of course.
Because we're in coalition together. And so I'm at the state hearing the testifiers and the opposition. I'm hearing these principals say that suspension is a tool. And I keep hearing like Brene Brown saying like shame is the tool of the oppressor, and how suspension is a form of shame. And so when you say it's a tool, kind of tool, it's an oppressive tool.
Absolutely.
You know, and then they were talking about how with regard to like violent incidences, and in this bill, they're not taking away that opportunity to say that, oh, a child was violent, hurt another student, hurt a teacher, they need time to process, to restore. That is not what the bill is saying. And so really this idea of it just being a tool, if it's a tool to keep kids and teachers safe, the suspension, then it still does that. What it doesn't do is punish kids for subjective incidences that could be defined in any way, shape, or form and left up to the discretion of the administrator or the teacher.
Absolutely. All of these bills have like explicit language around situations where the child's at risk of harming themselves or others, including the statements to school staff. You know, we've had conversations with the County Attorneys Association, with law enforcement about this bill, that those are the major sources of opposition to that last one. And there's language in there to say, like, if you're doing an emergency investigation that you would need to get some information from a child right now in order to protect their own safety or the safety of this entire school setting, then the rest of the evidence issues can be litigated into court. We understand that piece, but that's not really what we're seeing on the everyday basis and what's like truly creating really intense harm for young people. What we're seeing is opportunities where young people are removed from protective adults, an attorney or a family member who might say like, hey, we want to make sure that this isn't going to be used against you. They're being separated from those settings, and we want to make sure that they have those opportunities when they can.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for going over that. Again, there will be opportunities for everyone to ask questions on both of these sections in our next section here. So please feel free to, just add your questions in the chat, and we'll continue to move forward with our next section on paying the debt owed to our students. So again, as I mentioned before, the state of Minnesota has a $17 billion surplus. And the big question for the state is, how are we going to use those resources to improve the quality of education for all of our students? And also balance that priority with several other key priorities that other stakeholders, including myself, actually hold, right? And so, we are following 3 specific issues in terms of funding our education system and making sure that our students are getting what they are owed, especially because we have been taking, the way that we built this surplus was by taking away from education. Our schools have been starved for years on resources. So let's begin at the top and looking at special education and the underfunding of special education. The federal government put forward a bill several years ago under the Bush administration that specified, or reauthorized the bill actually, that specified the type of resources that need to be put towards special education services. And the state was on the hook for a part of it, and the federal government was on the hook for a part of it. And neither have actually done their job in terms of funding special education adequately. And so what has been created is this, what's called or referenced as the cross subsidy. And so the cross subsidy is how districts are mandated to provide services to students that receive special education services, then have to use their general aid, not their special education aid, but their general aid to cover those costs, which create a huge challenge for districts that have larger populations of special education students, including Minneapolis and St. Paul public schools. And so this underfunding has resulted in, big challenges for the district, especially Minneapolis public schools, to, have a balanced budget every year, and usually results in cuts to their budget. And so the state has said, look, and the state is starting to realize, look, we need to actually properly and adequately fund special education services. And so there is a bill moving currently through the legislative process right now that does say we want to fully fund special education. We will close this cross subsidy by 100%. The challenge is that money isn't currently tied to any type of improvement in services that students that are receiving special education services are getting. That is not improved outcomes. In fact, the bill that is currently moving isn't actually even saying that money has to go towards special education. And so there are some real issues with the bill that need to be improved upon. And we also know that the districts and our students across the state need those resources in order to be successful. And so we are supporting that advocacy, but we also want to make sure that those resources are getting to the students that actually need them, and they're not just generated and then sent wherever they can go. And we also need to make sure that we are focusing on data collection and making sure that we know are students being held in restrictive environments? Are they being placed in rigorous course taking? Are they not? Where are they? How are they being disciplined, right? Because we know that, going back to disrupting the school to prison pipeline, a significant portion of students that are suspended or expelled or have some type of engagement with the legal system are students of color, but are also students that receive special education services, right? And it's an intersection of those two identities that are put in jeopardy every single day and they walk into our buildings. We know that students of color are 3.8 times more likely in Minneapolis public schools to have some type of dismissal action, whether that is suspension, expulsion, or engagement with the criminal justice system. And so we have real work to do there, and we have to make sure that these resources result in the minimizing or the elimination of that type of action, or being put in restrictive environments that they don't need to actually be put into, and also are creating a welcoming environment so that all students can actually be successful. Our second bullet point here is really focused on fully funding English language learning services. We know, again, same situation for special education. English language learners are receiving not enough resources in order to be successful. And school districts and schools individually are having to pull money from different areas because they're not being adequately funded to actually support the services, the mandatory services that these students learn or need. And so oftentimes either these mandatory services are not provided, or they're not adequate, or they're underperformed. And so we need to make sure that, again, same thing, there is a bill moving through the legislature that does adequately fund special or English language learning services at 100%, so that all students who do not speak English as their primary language have an opportunity to learn while also learning to speak English in their school setting. The final bill that we want to talk about here in the final issue is really connecting the education funding formula to inflation. Every year we have a situation in which school districts across the state are begging for money, not because they want to do, super new innovative stuff, but because they have to keep up with the rising costs of inflation, whether that's a new transportation budget or, the rising cost of electricity, heat, those types of things, contracts. These are really important issues. And it's really important that the state help schools meet those needs and meet those costs so that our schools can run effectively.
This is one of those issues too, where like the rural urban divide sort of comes down because rural districts also face those and a lot of times their cost increase at even greater rates than in like the Twin Cities.
Yeah, exactly. Because the Twin Cities, and especially St. Paul Public Schools, Minneapolis Public Schools, and Hennepin schools, they can do this at economies of scale, right? They have more students that can pay for, that generate revenue that can pay for, these rising costs, but still not to a totally adequate amount. But rural communities are really feeling this hard. And so it's really important that we see that there is just an automatic connection between education funding and how we see inflation. Because oftentimes the school system is only given a 2% increase or a 3% increase. And, maybe, we know inflation went up to like 7% this last year, right? And so, we are really looking at how do we make sure that schools, again, aren't necessarily doing anything innovative, which we want to actually see schools do more innovation to meet the needs of our students, but actually can just keep up with the rising costs that they are encountering every single day. This issue is also really important. And there is a bill moving right now that would say we are going to increase the funding formula by 5% for this year and next year, and then just tie the education funding formula to inflation moving forward into the future. So this bill is very difficult because it has that ongoing cost. It's not just this one-time opportunity while we have a $17 billion surplus. But if we value education, if we're going to say that Minnesota is going to be the best place in the country for kids, this is the type of investment that we need to absolutely see for all of our students. And so, when we talk about the opposition to this bill, there's a lot of support, actually, especially from the majority party, for all of this funding. Like I said, there are bills that support each of these areas. Unfortunately, there isn't a bill quite filed yet in terms of improving the outcomes for special education students, but that is coming. However, again, there are competing priorities at the state. And we know at the state level, they're looking at a lot of different things. And the governor has said, we are interested in funding all these things, but we're not interested in funding them to the level that some of these bills are moving. And so, for example, for fully funding special education, the governor currently wants to only fund 50% of the cross subsidy as opposed to fully funding it 100%. The governor has also said that he wants to decrease the cross subsidy for English language learners to only 67% of the cross subsidy, which means, I think 32%, 33% of the cross subsidy would actually be filled, and districts would still be on the hook for 67% of those expenditures that they put into.
So he wants to go to 50 on special education and 37 on English language.
33%.
33, okay.
Yeah. And then for, connecting the education funding to the inflation, the governor currently has said that he wants to cap that at 3%. So if inflation goes up to 7% again, or is it even at 4% or 5%, the governor said we want to cap that at 3%, the 3% increase. And the history behind some of the increases here when we're talking about 2% or 3%, 3.5% increase in our overall education funding formula would be historic. The state has never seen that type of money put into education before. But again, the challenge is that we have seen inflation rise to historic levels as well, and not even meeting the rate of inflation presents a real scarcity mindset at the school site, at the district level, which harms educators, harms teachers, harms students, and harms our communities. And so we're really advocating for fully funding our special education services, our English language learner services, and connecting the education funding formula to inflation 100% all the way, so that schools don't have to figure out, where are they going to get money from every year. And then also putting that burden back on taxpayers, local taxpayers, when you're talking about, seeing property taxes increase or referendums being put on the ballot, which we always support, but it's because the state has refused to step up to totally fund our public education. So those are the real opportunities that we see in adequate funding for public education this year, and making sure that students are getting what they need in order to run, go off and solve some of the biggest challenges that our society currently sees. So that is where we're at right now, and we're excited about our full policy agenda.
Thanks, Kenneth. This was quite a lot. So thank you so much to the three of you. This is a lot of bills. Before we go into the Q&A, and so I've been looking down, monitoring my phone, so feel free to put those questions in the Q&A section of the Zoom meeting. I want to start, though, before we go into the Q&A, by just again thanking our panelists. And I just want to let the guests joining us on Zoom know that you will receive a list of the priorities with specific bill numbers in a follow-up piece from the foundation after this. And I also want to encourage everyone to go to the Advancing Equity Coalition website and sign up for their weekly alerts about some of these policies. And what they'll also give you is tips on how to elevate this agenda on your own social media. So look to the Advancing Equity Coalition website for that. Kenneth, do you want to give them the website really quickly?
So the specific website to sign up for the weekly action alerts is advancing-equity-power_the_plan_23.
We'll send that out for everyone, so to help you to be able to find it. And then so from that, again, want you to elevate this policy agenda on your own social media. And now I'm going to just jump into some of the questions from the chat. So hold on one second, I'm going to pull them up.
And then while you're pulling up, I think the link is being put in the chat currently. So you can go there and you can sign up for our weekly action alerts to help us elevate this agenda and make sure that, we see the type of policy change and funding that we need from the state in order for students to be successful in MPS and across Minnesota.
Right. So one of the questions I have is, will funding special education close the looming fiscal cliff for MPS that they're facing?
Great question. The answer is no. So, when it comes to education funding, there are lots of people that are responsible for, where we're at currently with, especially in Minneapolis, where we're at. Again, there's underfunding happening at the state, there's underfunding happening at the federal level, and then it's also about the decisions that the district and school board has made over the last several years. And so while funding, fully funding public education through, fully funding special education or fully funding English language learners, or connecting the education funding formula to inflation does help the district a lot. The district itself also needs to make some difficult decisions in the coming year to make sure that they can operate and provide students with this type of education that they deserve. And so we know that, honestly, trying to fully fund special education or any of the bills that we talked about today, it helps the district keep the lights on, but it doesn't necessarily dramatically change I'd say like the trajectory for learning in Minneapolis public schools. And we know that, again, the district is going to have to make some difficult decisions when it comes to how they want to continue to operate the entire district so that the district can continue to serve students. Right now, what is staving off a fiscal cliff is the use of the federal aid money that was produced or that was given by the federal government through COVID. And so for the last few years, actually, the district has been able to, use those resources almost totally to not do anything innovative to help students with learning recovery over the last several years, but really just keep the lights on and not have to dramatically change the district. So even the funding that's going to come from the state isn't quite enough to, push off or prevent the district from facing this fiscal cliff, but it will help the district keep the lights on and, give it an opportunity to continue to be solvent and, operate.
Thanks, Kenneth.
Yeah.
The next question, I think it's best directed at you, but Nafisa, but like, let me know what you think.
Okay.
Will efforts to pipeline more teachers of color into the education system be protected if there are staffing cuts due to declining enrollment? Like, how does that all work?
That's a great question. I can speak for Minneapolis Public Schools because I was a part of that and changing the teacher contract so that seniority-based layoffs don't impact teachers of color as much because of LIFO, last in, first out. Usually, like first in, last out. No, last in, first out. Usually the most recent hires, because of all this policy change, are the teachers of color, and because of the pathways are the teachers of color. And so our union had a priority to protect teachers of color from seniority-based layoffs, from racially isolated schools, HBCU graduates, dual language, all those kind of carve outs. So in Minneapolis, yes, to a certain extent, but there still just needs to be more that happens to protect teachers of color, including the seniority-based layoff.
Yeah, I would just add that, there are districts that are like Minneapolis that are working to negotiate in their collective bargaining agreements with their teachers unions to figure out ways to protect teachers of color, and different districts are doing it in different ways. And, like Nafisa said, there are carve outs currently in place for teachers of color, including making sure that any underrepresented teacher in comparison to the student population is protected from this next round of layoffs, which we're anticipating will be large in Minneapolis, again, because Minneapolis has faced several years of underfunding and is also, not dramatically changed how they've delivered services, and they've lost a significant amount of students, which means they've lost a significant amount of revenue. They will have to make changes, but, because of the work that Nafisa and several other educators did during the strike last year, there will be an opportunity to protect our educators of color. So
I also think it made a statement too. I would say, with regard to policy, yes, but also with regard to advocacy and empowering teachers of color, which I am grateful for as a teacher to be a member of AEC and Education for Excellence, because it does say, like, you deserve to be here. Your cultural assets, your experience that you bring to the classroom matters. And if you collectively fight together, you could protect each other. And so I think that that is really what helped us to say that, like, no, we're here. We're going to fight to stay, and we'll do whatever we got to do to make sure you hear us. So I feel like it was a twofer too.
And then for Malika, with some of the changes related to suspensions, what are maybe the principals associations, what are they like misunderstanding potentially about some of this proposed legislation? Do you have any insights?
I don't know if it's a misunderstanding. I will say that like this has been work that's been happening for a long time. And I think there have been lots of conversations. I do think there's just like a fundamental disagreement. You know, perhaps if I'm, yeah, I will say like I think a difference in opinion is about like the amount of work that can and should be done before the need for exclusionary discipline, before the need for a suspension. So the bill lays out pretty explicitly some non-exclusionary methods of working with young people and families, including like creating agreements or contracts with young people and families, trying out different methods of instruction or instructional spaces. And, you know, like I can empathize with the immense workload of being a school administrator and even the immense workload of being a classroom teacher, right? And that is a lot of energy to put into the relationship with a particular young person, where it is often it's easier to just say, okay, you can't be at school for 2 days. But what we know and what we also see is that when that child returns to school, if we haven't put in the investment in trying to make it work and teaching them other ways to engage with their peers or in the classroom environment, then the workload is just bigger. It's just like putting off an issue rather than investing in the front end. So I would say like that's a difference of opinion. And there are many educators and many administrators who know this to be true and who are already investing in these different non-exclusionary ways to work with young people and families. But I think that continues to be a challenge.
And then a follow-up, someone asked, how does the bill bring parents into those discussions, or does it bring parents more into like some of that?
Yeah, so there are a few specific pieces of language within the bills that call in opportunities for partnership with parents during creating a plan for success around young people. But I do think that there are other mechanisms for parental involvement that you know, our coalitions are working on that would probably address this a bit more. So there's another piece of legislation that we've continued to try to work, and that there's some language that hasn't gotten a lot of traction this session, but around creating a better parent complaint process for situations where a child is excluded or there's been discipline handed out that the family doesn't agree with. And so that creates like a kind of reactive measure, but also the parent complaint process would, if implemented in the ways that we'd like to see it implemented, would ask and require more partnership with parents who we know to be like the best experts on their children, to help create the support and success plans and procedures for working with their child.
You know, I think, you know, especially when we're talking about some of the ban on K3 suspensions, or, you know, withholding recess as a punishment. You know, I think about, you know, what we're asking people to do. We're taking away this tool, right? We're taking away this tool of oppression. But just think how much harder it like we're talking about excluding, pushing out a third grader at the oldest. What does that mean for the third grader that missed 2 days of instruction? How are you helping a third grader who's struggling with reading, you know, who now you've pushed out of the classroom, come back into the classroom and help catch them up because now they're further behind, right? Or what does that mean for a student who has a lot of energy and you are telling them that they can't go out to recess because they have so much energy? Like, what are we doing? You know, we're suspending students because they're not showing up to school. So we're telling students, and this isn't more so in the older grades, but we're telling students like, hey, your punishment for not coming to school is to not come to school, right? Like that is a huge issue. We're doing things that just don't make sense. And so, you know, I think while yes, and, you know, hearing from the principals and talking to principals about, you know, this issue, especially for the youngest grades, we're asking them to do something different, which is hard. But also maybe once we get over change, the hard part of change, maybe what we're doing is actually easier. And it just requires a mindset shift from not being so punitive, but thinking about what's going to make sense for this child to be successful in our classroom. And that's what it should be about at the end of the day, and not just about making my life easier right now.
Can I add to that in regard to the parent question as well? Changing the law empowers the parent to say, wait a minute, you can't kick my baby out of school right now, but we can partner and figure out what this could look like. So it does give the parent a tool, right, of liberation and be able to say that, you know, I don't agree, because a grievance process would be able to, you have to approve, and you have to have certain institutional knowledge, maybe some connections. You got to know who's who and what's what, versus saying, at least I know the law and we can work around whatever, but I know the law is that you cannot do this to my baby, you know? So I do think it empowers the parent.
Yeah, and I would say, you know, we heard from a lot of educators and a lot of families during the height of the pandemic, where distance learning was the norm across the state, that there were like all of these really innovative ways that schools were thinking about partnerships with their families, because they had to, right? Like, how else are we going to deliver instruction if not by partnering with a person who's like literally sitting next to this child? And as young people were welcomed back into buildings, there were all of these interesting ways that schools found to think through, like, okay, now that you're coming back to school, how do we reintroduce you to being around your peers? How do we think about like what you're supposed to do when you're in a reading class, when you're in second grade and supposed to sit still for 60 minutes? Like, all of that new knowledge that we learned in the pandemic can be put into action. And I think if we, you know, the fear of taking away of the oppressive tool, well, maybe we just innovate and we figure out like the lessons we learned from the pandemic, but also generally how we can put them into action and practice more regularly too.
Right. One of the other questions that came in is, would we as Minnesota be unprecedented if we were to make these large investments in funding ELL and special education? Are there other states that have done this? Do you know?
That's a good question. I don't actually know the type of investment that is currently being put into special education in other states. I know E3 has been working a little bit on this bill, and so
I think our focus has been around the compensatory aid, around increasing the cap around poverty and special education, not special education, but education benefits that other states have done, but not around EL. So I'm willing to bet that it would be a precedent. It would set a precedence for how we approach funding education.
Okay. One of the people in the audience asked if Malika would give examples of the subjective behaviors that are leading to suspensions, just to go into that a little bit more.
I'm happy to start, and then I'll let every
I see it.
You know, a lot of the things that we see as subjective include like willful defiance or disrespect, those not following instructions. Those are things that we see across the board, but especially in those younger grades, as being challenges often of like communication or relationship or trust between young people and educators, and real opportunities for investing in relationships where like excluding a young person from the classroom actually isn't going to solve that problem much better. I don't know if you have other examples.
Yeah, subjective, like standing up. You need to stand up. So a kid who has ADHD and has something novel to play with, or a fidget, or, you know, has a tic. Or I've done a lot of work around like trauma-informed teaching as well. So I think about like compassion, accountability versus punitive measures. So how do you recognize when a kid is in crisis or is experiencing some kind of trauma, so that you're not attributing their behavior to something that is intentional? There's also like disruption to learning, disrupting the learning, you know, it's like, well, who defines that?
It's very subjective.
Would be the teacher, right? It would be defined by the principal. So the subjectiveness is really backed by your bias. So whoever asks for the question, I would think about, when do you feel unsafe? What are your triggers? Because if a little kid is triggering you, reminding you of your own trauma or disrupting your emotional state, then how you're viewing the behavior could be totally subjective to someone who says, oh, I know what that looks like. I understand that behavior. This is what this kid needs in order to learn.
Yeah, and I would just add, like, again, none of this is to say that like this work is easy. Like if you've ever dealt with a second grader who's doing nothing but rolling their eyes at you, like you like at some
I
point you're
have a second grader, an 8-year-old.
yeah,
I
so you
know,
probably want to
yes.
shake them sometimes,
Yeah.
right? But what we know to be true in working with young people is that they're much more accountable to relationships than they are
Yes.
to rules.
Uh,
And
Yes.
so by investing in non-exclusionary discipline, by saying, okay, I see that eye roll as something more than just like you're trying to get under my nerves, but instead some form of communication or some sort of relational rift that we're having, and investing in like requiring that educators and schools are investing in repairing that relationship rather than saying, okay, you can't be here, you can't learn because we have relational challenges. I think that we're going to have better outcomes for kids.
So another question from the chat is, why should we support fully funding special education if it won't also be tied to positive outcomes?
So, yes, I think it's a great question. I think it's an important question to ask. And we know that these are the issues that we care about, right? These 3 sections that have 8 different policy suggestions are really important. No bill is perfect.
Mhm.
We are blue in the face in trying to ask people, and we talk about this regularly. We need to talk about special education outside of just the funding of special education, because we do not talk enough about what is happening to students who are supposed to be receiving special education services. The lack of services that students received during the pandemic, they have not recovered from, and they have not even resembled coming close to figuring out a plan on how we're going to do that. So what we need to do is we need to push for tying that funding to, 1, special education students, 2, to improved outcomes. And we need to keep advocating for that. At the same time, we know that schools are struggling to pay for these services, and they're pulling money from all different directions because they're mandatory, so they have to, and because of the parent empowerment that is in place because of the laws, which is great. Like, they are being asked to do the services that are required while the state hasn't put them in place. So I would say, and you all can, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this as well. I would say we still need to ask for the funding to make sure that special education is fully funded, because our students deserve it. Our students absolutely deserve it. It's not the fault of kids that there aren't more requirements around improving outcomes. And at the same time, we need to make sure that we continue to ask for those outcomes, for schools to be held accountable to parents, to our community, to our policy makers around what type of outcomes are produced by that increased investment. But we shouldn't be punishing kids for the lack of accountability that actually exists around that funding. We should make sure that they at least get what's needed, and then we continue to advocate for those improved outcomes and for those requirements from the state. But I'll let you say more.
My question would be, what happens when you don't? What happens when you don't is that you have overworked special education teachers who have an extreme caseload. Specifically in Minneapolis Public School, it's really a case of within school segregation, because Black kids in Minneapolis Public Schools are 5 times more likely to be in special education. So what's happening is that you're driving all these Black kids into special education without the supports, without the teachers that they need, without the minutes that they need, and then you put them in a classroom with a teacher who is not trained in special education with regard to modifications and accommodations, then the teacher becomes overwhelmed. So you're creating an overwhelmed workforce of educators who don't have the resources they need to reach the children, and then they feel inadequate. So then they leave. So you're not fully funding public education creates an intersectional problem with regard to teachers, students. I used to teach at the juvenile corrections, the JDC, in the summertime. And a lot of those students who I taught were in special education. So you talk about discipline, you talk about all these things. Funding special education, fully funding special education can get to the gaps, can get to the teachers, could relieve some of the teachers so that they can get to the important work. On our lobby day, we invited the special education teachers and our teacher action team for E4E to come and speak to the issue. They couldn't come because there's such a special education shortage, teacher shortage, that they couldn't even come to speak their own words and talk about their own experiences. And so my question would be like, are you willing to take the risk? Because we're not stopping how many kids are being funneled into special education, but we're stopping the funding for it. My question is it worth the risk? I don't think so. Let's see what happens when you fully fund it and advocate for accountability measures rather than doing it the other way around and limiting funding. Because we see what that does.
Yeah, and I would also say, like, we're at this point in the legislative session where like everything is still really possible. And so by contacting our legislators and letting them know, like, yes, we support this bill and we want to see more, like doing that today, doing that this week, doing that over the next couple of weeks, like there is still the opportunity to make all of our dreams come true. You know, like I just think that it's really possible. And in the work that I've done at the legislature and what I've seen is that none of our legislators are like experts in every single issue area that they're required to be. They really are looking to us to get involved and to let them know and make them aware. And in those times when I've had conversations or emailed a legislator and been like, hey, I like this bill, but like, have you thought about this implication? Many times they just aren't aware. And so I think the opportunity to like have this conversation today, but then to sign up for these email alerts so that you can like advocate for the reality and the future that you want to see, it's still all possible right now.
The last thing I'll add, you got us on this question. We're fired up. I would just say that
Still okay.
you know, we are really focused on also following the folks who are the most impacted. And I'll say disability advocates and special education parents, I've said time and time again, they want this money and they want the accountability. And so they're saying, and we don't have, you know, a specific group that focuses solely on disability advocacy today, but in our partnerships that we have, they have said, we need to continue to advocate for this money. And also we need to continue to elevate, you know, this issue around accountability, around improved outcomes. And so, you know, we want to follow the ones who are most impacted by this issue. The other thing that I'll just say from a systems level, and especially when looking at, again, our primary focus as a coalition and as an organization in Minneapolis Public Schools is, if we only advocate for connecting the education formula to the to inflation, Minneapolis and St. Paul are going to be the most impacted in a negative way, because Minneapolis and St. Paul have such a high percentage of their students, nearly 20% of their students that qualify for special education services, as Nafisa was saying. And so if Minneapolis doesn't get this money, if St. Paul doesn't get this money, if no one in the state gets this money, it's going to be Minneapolis and St. Paul that are going to be holding the largest deficits, and they're still going to be figuring out how are we going to pull money to better support students. And so, you know, that is another really big issue. And again, then you start to talk about the intersection of race and ability and how schools are identifying it, especially. Then we start, you know, we're talking about underfunding our Black and Brown students and our Indigenous students at extremely high levels. And so we have to advocate for it, even if that means we don't have everything that we want yet, but we are still working on getting everything that we want.
We're getting close on time. So before I kick it to Kenneth to give us the last word, I just want to remind everybody out there, as Malika said, to sign up for the AEC action alerts. And then following this briefing, the Minneapolis Foundation will be sending a list of the bills we discussed today with House and Senate numbers. And then also we'll have a link in there that will help you to find who your state legislator is and reach out to them. And I just want to emphasize, like Malika said, that our state representatives do want to hear from us about different issues, because again, they don't know everything and they're paid to respond to us, or they're elected to respond to us. So I hope everybody takes that really seriously and reaches out about the issues in this agenda that you find to be compelling. I also just want to say it's been a pleasure again to be on this panel with these three amazing leaders. All three of these organizations, just as a funder who's been in philanthropy for 7 years, I've seen them walk and talk like they walk and live into what they say they're about in terms of their mission. They're inclusive, they're BIPOC, either BIPOC led or very much influenced by issues from Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. And they are out here every day fighting for equity. And so I just want to put, just give a special thanks to Malika from the Legal Rights Center. Thank you so much, Nafisa, for representing Educators for Excellence, and then Kenneth again for representing the coalition. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kenneth to just close us out.
Yeah. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Again, thank you both for taking time out of your day to help, be the experts on these issues, and couldn't have done it without you all. So thank you so much. Like Patrice said, look out for an email from the Minneapolis Foundation about next steps, about bills to follow. Also, we'll keep everyone updated on ways to make sure that this agenda stays fully elevated throughout the rest of the legislative session. So please sign up for our weekly action alerts. I think the link is going to go in the chat one more time. And then you can also support the work of Advancing Equity Coalition by making a donation today, as we rely on the generous support of our community. So thank you again so much for your time, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.